Hello YouTube. In this video we're going to talk about an interesting critique of the history of philosophy. This is presented by Hanno Sauer in his article The End of History, where he argues that studying the history of philosophy is not helpful for solving philosophical problems. So more precisely, Sauer's target is a view that he calls philosophical historicism. Philosophical historicism claims that a good method for thinking about contemporary philosophical problems is the study of what historical authors wrote about those problems a long time ago, right? So a good method for investigating the question, what is knowledge, is to read what ancient philosophers wrote about that question. Now, philosophical historicism doesn't claim that history of philosophy is the only way to investigate this, or even the primary way to investigate this. It doesn't even claim that every philosopher who investigates a contemporary issue should study history of philosophy. It only claims that history of philosophy can play a significant role in helping us to investigate contemporary issues. So if you are somebody who's interested in a question like, what is knowledge, you will probably glean a lot of value from reading what ancient philosophers had to say about that question. So it's basically a worthwhile use of your time. Like, one worthwhile use of your time, if you want to understand what knowledge is to have a look at what historical philosophers said about what knowledge is. Pretty straightforward idea. So Sauer's claim is this. He says, the epistemic aims of philosophy, if there are any, are frustrated by engaging with the history of philosophy, and, moreover, becoming acquainted with the history of philosophy contributes very little to improving our understanding of philosophical problems and their potential solutions, so we would be better off doing much less of it. Now, I should say that Sauer is fairly broad about what counts as history here. He explicitly cites Aristotle, Hegel, and even Wittgenstein as philosophers that people spend too much time thinking about. So, I mean, even some of the stuff from, like, the 20th century is out, right? It's seems like pretty much anything from before about, like, 1970 is problematic, although, I mean, he doesn't give the specific cutoff point, but, like, the vast majority of philosophical work in the past, it seems, is off the table on this view. So why should we think that history of philosophy is a waste of time? Well, the central argument is the island analogy. So Sauer asks us to imagine a remote island populated by a few million people. They have no modern technology, no modern scientific knowledge. They don't understand general relativity or the modern evolutionary synthesis or the Big Bang or anything like that. They have no sophisticated mathematics or logic. Many of them are unaware that a world exists outside of their island, and even fewer of them have any knowledge of what the wider world is like. Even so, people on this island often write philosophy, right? So the question is, should philosophers in our society care much about the philosophical work being produced by people on this island? Like, should we spend a significant amount of time investigating what they have to say? I mean, would we expect that the people on this island have significant philosophical insights? Well, Sauer says no, we wouldn't expect that. He thinks it would clearly just be a mistake to spend any significant amount of time studying the writings of these islanders. And the reason is fairly straightforward, right? So consider any problem that is dealt with by the islanders, call it problem X. Well, given that problem X is a subject of research in contemporary philosophy, we can take it that it is difficult and significant. And the question is, how much weight should we assign to the opinion of a person regarding a difficult problem if that person has no relevant scientific knowledge regarding the problem, no familiarity whatsoever with the recent academic literature regarding the problem? Well, Sauer says we should assign basically no weight whatsoever to that. In no other situation would we take such an opinion seriously. Now, obviously, there may be non-philosophical reasons to study the islanders. Anthropology is a worthwhile subject for its own sake, right? So it may just be that we are interested in like, okay, what do these people believe? What do they say, right? Why do they believe what they believe? That's just interesting from an anthropological point of view, right? So the idea is not that like what Sauer's saying is not that, well, everybody should ignore the islanders. What he's saying is specifically that it's very unlikely that they would have significant philosophical insight. So specifically, if you are a philosopher trying to deal with a contemporary philosophical problem, it's very unlikely that you're going to glean much from reading the work of these islanders. They are simply too ignorant of the relevant literature. So it's extremely unlikely that they're going to be a source of any thus far undiscovered philosophical truths. Now, the point of this analogy, of course, is the island is supposedly relevantly similar to the history of philosophy. And so it's largely pointless for philosophers to study the history of philosophy for the same reason that it would be largely pointless for philosophers to study the output of the islanders. The basic issue, as Sauer sees it, is that both the islanders and historical authors are going to be wrong about basically everything. And they're going to be wrong in ways that are probably quite unsophisticated. So you have to kind of think about, like, well, what are the sort of like sources of information that we use to come up with philosophical ideas? Like, how do we come up with philosophical claims in the first place? Well, Sauer says there's two basic sources. You can use, first of all, the scientific information that's available at the time, right? So you can think about you know the sort of things that are empirically established, and then those empirical facts will kind of raise philosophical problems. So I mean, like in the contemporary world, we know about certain facts about how minds work, right? Like we know that there's things like the effect of like split brain operations, for example, and maybe that tells us that might raise some interesting philosophical ideas about how consciousness works or how the mind works or something like that, right? Like, so we can kind of use the contemporary science to like generate philosophical problems. And the other way that we generate philosophical ideas is just the work of one's peers. We just read what other people have to say. Now, the trouble is that if you look at philosophers of the past, they lack crucial information. They lack the relevant background scientific information, they lack the conceptual sophistication, they lack any knowledge of the current debates, so it's highly unlikely that they're right about anything. Philosophers in the distant past lacked the basic competence that we require for doing philosophy. I mean, one way to think about it is that if any contemporary philosopher were to lack the kind of basic competence in the same sort of way, we just wouldn't take them seriously at all. So, like, when it comes to judging contemporary philosophical work, we apply this fairly simple and obvious epistemic criterion. So Sauer says, philosophical competence requires familiarity with the relevant theoretical and empirical state of the art. So that's a bare minimum standard for taking contemporary work seriously. I mean, in terms of what will get published in journals, in terms of what will get discussed by philosophers, that's the bare minimum that we require. And it rules out a lot of contemporary people. I mean, it rules out the opinion of people who just, I guess, like, lay persons who just don't like know anything about, the relevant. So, like, if you imagine somebody in, I don't know, talking about philosophy of biology, but who just doesn't really know anything about biology, like maybe they're like a creationist or something. Well, no philosopher of biology is going to take them seriously, right? It also rules out a lot of people who are actually, maybe skilled in other areas or well published in other areas. Sam Harris wrote a very popular book which discussed ethics and metaethics, but barely any professionals in ethics and metaethics pay any attention to what Sam Harris says. Why is that? Well, I mean, other explanations are available, but what professional philosophers would tell you is that the reason why they don't pay any attention to him is because he obviously has no familiarity with the state-of-the-art theoretical literature, right? Although, I mean, like, maybe he was more familiar with the empirical stuff, but ultimately, Sam Harris just doesn't seem to know anything about metaethics, for instance, and so, like, why are we going to pay any attention to what he says about metaethics? That's that would be the answer that a professional philosopher would give about why they don't pay attention to him. So this criterion is used to sort of rule out a whole bunch of contemporary people. But clearly this criterion, if you were to apply it to everybody throughout history, well, it would rule out basically every philosopher from the distant past, and also basically every philosopher from the not so distant past. So we all apply this criterion to contemporary authors. Why should historical philosophers not be held to the same standard? Sauer gives a few specific examples of this. So he asks us, for instance, to consider the work of authors like Plato and Rousseau on the virtues and vices of democracies. So when they wrote about democracies and they were assessing democracies from a philosophical point of view, there was a great deal of information that was just not available to them, including, and I quote, historical experiences with developed democracies, empirical evidence regarding democratic movements in developing countries, various formal theorems regarding collective decision-making and preference aggregation, such as the Condorcet jury theorem, Arrow's impossibility results, the Hong-Page theorem, the median voter theorem, the miracle of aggregation, etc., existing studies on voter behavior, polarization, deliberation, information, public choice economics, including rational irrationality and democratic realism, and of course the whole subsequent debate on their own arguments. Again, imagine if there was a contemporary author who wrote a philosophical assessment of democracy, but who was completely ignorant of all of this stuff. They just wouldn't be taken seriously, and we wouldn't expect them to have any interesting insights. And this is why we wouldn't pay attention to the output of the islanders, right? The general point is, it really doesn't matter how intelligent, creative, inventive, talented, and so on you might be. That's actually not enough. It's like having some, amazing intelligence or, brilliant sort of creativity is actually not nearly as significant as having access to the knowledge that we've accumulated over the last 2,000 years. Like the average like undergrad in political philosophy is going to be so much more informed about the issues regarding democracy than Plato was. You'd probably get more out of reading what like some average undergrad has to say about it than you would out of what Plato has to say about it. Even if Plato was way smarter, he just didn't have enough relevant information. So Sauer says that the following propositions seem to be true. These aren't what he claims. So he says, it is unlikely that historical authors were right about anything because they lacked the scientific and or empirical information required for it, since so many philosophical claims or theories depend on scientific and or empirical propositions. And second, it is unlikely that historical authors were right about anything because they lacked the theoretical and or conceptual sophistication required for it, since philosophical competence hinges on at least a basic degree of familiarity with current philosophical debates. Now, in fact, I actually think that Sauer would probably want to say something a bit stronger here. It's not just that it's highly unlikely that historical authors were right about anything. It's also that their positions are going to be less consistent, less coherent, less plausible, less generally well thought through. Because it's like over time, we have as we kind of learn more about the world and we develop better sort of more sophisticated concepts, we can kind of start to see that, okay, well, maybe this earlier person was, equivocating in some way that wasn't obvious to them, but as we've kind of refined our concepts, it's become obvious now, right? Like over time, as we kind of learn more and more stuff, we become better at presenting ideas, not just ideas that are right, but like ideas that are coherent. So even if you conceive of philosophy as being more about, mapping conceptual space rather than developing true theories, you're still not likely to gain much from reading historical authors, right? You would, even if you don't really care about, the facts, and you're just more interested in like engaging with a really well thought through, coherent position, you'd be better off reading the contemporary literature. So basically what this means is that I am a significantly better philosopher than Plato. I'm significantly better than Descartes, significantly better than David Hume. And I think that that's worth something. And if you agree with me that that's worth something, maybe you should just throw me some cash. You know, I have a Patreon, which you can sign up to if you want to support the channel. Obviously, these videos take quite a lot of time and work, and so, you know, it would really help if you could throw some money my way. I also have a PayPal if you just want to send in a donation. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think that, you know, given that what I'm doing is like actually, you know, better than almost every philosopher in history, that seems like it might be worth, I don't know, like £5 a month or something. I'm just saying. But if you don't have any money, that's fine. Maybe you could just give the video a like, subscribe, just, you know, help the channel in the algorithm. I'd appreciate that as well. All right, let's get back to the argument. So, okay, so that's the basic argument that Sauer gives. Now, there are going to be two broad lines of response available to the defender of history, to the philosophical historicist. So the first option is to deny the parity thesis that the philosophical work of the islanders is relevantly similar to work in the history of philosophy. So we can say, no, there is actually something about the work of past philosophers that makes it much more likely to be epistemically useful than the work being produced by the islanders. Or at least there's some feature of the work of past philosophers which shows that we don't really need to judge them according to these contemporary, like ordinary standards of philosophical competence. So here's one idea for a parity breaker. Understanding contemporary positions requires understanding historical positions. Philosophy is a kind of long conversation, and much of what's being said today won't make sense without knowing the conversation that preceded it. We need to know the history in order to understand the present. But the thing is that the islanders are completely isolated. They're not in conversation with anybody. They have no influence. So like with past philosophy, the reason to read it is that it's like, well, you won't really understand what the contemporary debates are even about unless you read what the past philosophers had to say. You know, you're not going to understand things like the sort of more recent developments in empiricism unless you kind of understand, okay, well, where did it come from? It came from people like, you know, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and then it sort of developed in, you know, and then there was like, you know, logical positivism and the problems with logical positivism that you know, as that sort of development goes on over time, that sort of shows you where contemporary versions of empiricism come from, and like why the contemporary empiricists hold the positions they do is because they're kind of responding to these issues that were raised historically, right? Like it's important to have that kind of understanding of where these positions come from. But with the islanders, because they're just isolated, they're not really going to, you know, you're not going to get anything from reading their work in terms of understanding the contemporary positions. I mean, I think the obvious problem with using this as a parity breaker is that it requires only as much history as you would learn in introductory courses, right? Like, it doesn't really give you a reason to specialize in history, and it certainly doesn't show that history will provide any significant philosophical insights that might advance the contemporary debates, right? So, I mean, it's like, yeah, okay, this is a good reason to teach the history when we teach courses in philosophy to people who are being introduced to the subject, but it doesn't seem to show that, you know, it's a good idea for like a professional philosopher to spend their time closely reading like David Hume and trying to figure out what Hume thought, right? Like that just isn't gonna, this doesn't show that that's that's a worthwhile use of their time. So is there another thing we might use as a parity breaker? Well, interestingly, in a later article, which is critical of his earlier article, Sauer himself suggests that there are indeed parity breakers. His first article was called The End of History. His later article was called The Ends of History. So most notably, one notable parity breaker is he says, history of philosophy is not actually analogous to a single small island. It's more analogous to a variety of many islands, and the specific islands that we choose to focus on were not chosen merely by accident. We don't just randomly select a particular location and time in the past and then obsess over the philosophical work produced by whoever was around at that random time and place. Instead, we have selected what appears to be the best philosophical work from all of history. So the many islands of history have, as it were, and Sauer says, have given us their best and brightest, the ones that stood the test of time. Contemporary philosophers may well have the benefit of more empirical knowledge, but they also have a disadvantage, because unlike the past philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, Hume, no contemporary philosopher has yet survived the relentless scrutiny of generations. So generation after generation of philosophers have selected the best philosophers of the past to highlight for us today, right? It's like people keep revisiting Hume, and we keep finding interesting things there. I mean, that seems to be what's happening, right? Like, there's a bunch of professional philosophers who kind of keep going back, and they're finding interesting things in what he wrote, and that has survived up until the present day. And the fact that previous generations have held the work of Hume in such high regard provides at least some evidence that Hume's work is indeed worthwhile, and maybe it continues to be worthwhile. And, this isn't the case for, there's a lot of historical philosophers that have just been completely forgotten. There are many philosophers who were famous in their time, but then have since kind of just, everybody's forgotten them. There are kind of these changing fashions, but there are certain people who just have remained influential for centuries or millennia. I mean, in the case of Plato, right? Like, you look at some of these ancient Greek philosophers, and they've just their influence has remained in place for an extremely long time. So this is one relevant difference, is that we're not just selecting history at random. The second general response to the island analogy is to grant the parity thesis, but argue that actually it would be philosophically useful to study the work of the islanders. So, I mean, we can say, they are, history of philosophy is in the same position as the islanders, but it actually is philosophically useful to study the islanders. Now, note that this is not to say that anybody ought to study the islanders, just that there's good reason to think that we might gain important philosophical insights from doing so, and as such, it's perfectly reasonable for a professional philosopher to closely study their worldview. So why would we think that we might gain philosophical insights from this? Well, here's one idea. One thing that the islanders offer is a radically alternative worldview. The beliefs and values of these islanders are obviously not guided by science, right? They're not naturalists. The way that they think about the world and the things that they care about have a completely different foundation. And even if we think that our worldview is more sophisticated than theirs, it may be interesting to engage with something that is based on this totally different foundation, for several reasons, really. So one thing that might happen is that they may have ways of thinking that are like counterexamples to claims of universality. An interesting real-life case of this is the debate about whether there is a distinctive Azande logic that is different from Western logic. So this derives from the anthropological work of E. Evans Pritchard. He was studying a group called the Azande, whose worldview is dominated by witchcraft. Now, Evans Pritchard noticed that there was this really obvious inconsistency in Azande reasoning about witchcraft. First of all, they believe that witches are people who have a kind of witchcraft substance in their bellies, right? Second, they believe that the witchcraft substance is inherited by the same-sexed children as the witch. So if a man has witchcraft substance, then his male children will also have witchcraft substance. Now, it immediately follows from all of this that all of the male descendants of a witch will themselves be witches. But the Azande do not draw this obvious conclusion, even when it's explicitly pointed out to them, right? Like, you can explicitly say, hey, like, you believe that all witches are the people with the witchcraft substance, you believe witchcraft substance is inherited by the same-sex children. Like, obviously, it follows, doesn't it, that, like, if you have a man, then every single male descendant is then going to be a witch. That does obviously follow. The Azande just don't draw that conclusion. And nor do they make any attempt to revise their beliefs, right? What Evans Pritchard reports is that the Azande simply, they just don't see the contradiction. Now, this is obviously a very complex matter, and there's a lot of questions about how this is properly interpreted. But there are some philosophers who have argued that what this indicates is that the Azande reason according to a distinctive logic. So David Bloor, for instance, has argued that there's like actually a distinctive Azande logic that is different from Western logic. And this has all sorts of implications for debates in the philosophy of logic. So that's interesting. We have there's actually just a bunch of philosophical literature about the comparison of Azande logic and Western logic that has taken place in, I think this debate was taking place in like the 80s and the 90s. I'm not sure if there's anything all that recent about it. But the point is this is exactly the sort of thing where we might have like a contemporary debate. This might add something to the contemporary debates about certain issues. Second point is that the worldview of the islanders may highlight deficiencies in our own worldview. For example, our culture is dominated by science, technology, naturalistic thinking. And when we think about how to deal with problems in our society, we tend to presuppose that the problems must be presented and solved within the framework of science and technology. I mean, very abstractly, I suppose, that we reason something like this. We understand ourselves as minds located in bodies that move around the world. We have various desires about the way the world should be. And then we have like a problem occurs when something causes suffering or when something frustrates our desires. And the solution to that problem will then involve manipulating the world in some way so as to bring it in line with our desires. And that's the promise of science and technology, right? Like, it helps us to solve problems. It helps us to manipulate the world so that we can bring the world in line with what our desires are. But there are many traditions that reject this whole framing of solutions and problems and solutions, right? That don't regard science as being particularly valuable. Consider the mystical traditions like Zen, right? If you are involved in one of these traditions, then you're not really going to see you're going to be quite critical of the idea that the way that you solve a problem is by manipulating something in the world, and you're not going to see science as being a particularly useful endeavor, even if science was able to deliver on its promise of helping us to manipulate nature. It's just like, that's not really the way that you, I suppose, most usefully will go about actually what you need to do is kind of just reframe the whole way you're thinking about like what a problem is. And perhaps oddly, it is actually relatively rare that philosophers are critical of science as such, although see my video Anti-Science for an attempt to present a few different critical perspectives. But the Islanders may be interesting because they offer a value system that just doesn't presuppose the primacy of science, right? Another point here is that philosophical methodology itself is a highly contentious matter. The standards that we are using to dismiss past philosophers and to dismiss the Islanders are standards that are historically contingent and actually quite recent developments. Like our current philosophical standards are based very much on the sort of institutionalization of philosophy into university departments. But it's not obvious that current philosophical methodology is actually best suited to solving all philosophical problems. It's not obvious that it's, that the contemporary philosophical methodology is the right way of going about thinking about, what philosophy is. There's a great deal of debate about what the point of philosophy is and what the appropriate philosophical methodology is. And maybe this kind of, maybe the style that has been developed in like analytic philosophy over the last century or so is just not useful for a wide range of subjects. So we might benefit from the alternative methodologies of the Islanders. After all, the Islanders are not stupid, right? They have, by their own standards, a sophisticated philosophical tradition. It doesn't meet the standards that we expect of philosophy today, but obviously they don't use our standards. And the whole point of what I'm saying here is taking seriously alternative methodologies might actually be useful, right? Like it might show us a different way of doing philosophy. So if all this is correct, then there is a clear epistemic role for the history of philosophy also, which is it reveals radically alternative worldviews. Because by engaging with the history of philosophy, we're engaging with people who have completely different foundational beliefs. And that might shed new light on contemporary problems. It might help us to see the problems in a new and maybe helpful way. So perhaps that's one thing we could say for the history of philosophy. All right, well, let's consider a few more arguments against philosophical historicism, though. So another argument is the statistical argument. There's a couple of points here. So first of all, one point to begin with is that you would generally expect earlier philosophers to be more famous, regardless of their philosophical competence, simply because they came first. So if you live at an earlier time in history, you're able to pick the low-hanging fruit, as it were. You're able to ask lots of big questions and stake out potentially interesting positions on those big questions, even if you're a fairly average philosopher. As time goes on and more work gets done on specific issues, it requires much more training to say anything novel about those issues. So, for instance, over time, more and more work gets done on the free will debate, which makes it harder to say something novel about the free will debate. So it's not surprising that Plato, for instance, was able to significantly advance the field. He had lower heights to climb to reach what was, at his time, the limit of human knowledge. And then he's had much more time after his death, right? He's had an enormous amount of time to acquire influence because there's all of these people coming after him who are reading him, right? So the point is, the earlier that you exist in philosophical history, the greater your chance to be philosophically influential, even if your work isn't particularly good, because you're going to be able to, stake out the sort of first positions on a whole bunch of big questions. You're going to have an enormous amount of time after you die in which more and more people are going to be able to read you. So this is basically a kind of debunking explanation for why we take earlier authors seriously. So that's the first point. The second point is, we should expect that there are far fewer brilliant philosophers historically than there are today. This point comes from Gregory Lewis. It was in a blog post for Daily News. But he makes this point that the human population has massively increased over the past century or so. So if you take the population of Attica in Plato's time, it was estimated to be about 250,000 to 300,000 people. And let's suppose that Plato was the most philosophically competent person in Attica at the time. Well, the population of modern-day Attica is about 3.8 million people, okay? Now, Plato's ability as the best of historical Attica, that puts him at a level of about 1 in 300,000 in terms of philosophical ability. In modern-day Attica, that would translate in a population of 3.8 million. If we're looking at the top 1 in 300,000, well, we would expect that to be about 13 people. There's going to be about 13 people who are at the top 1 in 300,000 in terms of philosophical ability. So, in other words, we would expect there to be about 13 Platos in modern-day Attica alone, never mind in the world, right? Sauer makes a similar point in his article. He says, statistically speaking, there should be 10 individuals in present-day Kaliningrad that are equally competent philosophers as Kant was. Now, of course, this point does assume that philosophical ability is kind of innate and distributed randomly, which is far too simplistic, because clearly philosophical ability has quite a lot to do with one's environment and training. But actually, from that point of view, if you look at it in terms of environment and training, then the idea that historical philosophers would have significant insights is even stranger. So this brings us to the next argument, which is the improved conditions argument. Basically, point of this is the conditions for developing philosophical competence are far better today than they were in the past. Lewis brings up a number of points here. So a few points, right? First of all, you develop philosophical skills in conversation with others. Okay, so You put your ideas out there, you encounter objections from other people who have different ways of seeing things, and this forces you to consider your own ideas more carefully. But there are far more philosophers alive today than at any time in history, and thanks to the internet, we have access to much of their work. So we just have access to more philosophy than ever before, and so simply having more people doing philosophy would be expected, that we would think would create a better environment for philosophical development, right? So today I can very easily engage with philosophers from different countries who work in different traditions. I can just sort of read philosophy endlessly. I mean obviously not everything is available, but with the internet, yeah, I have access to a huge amount. I have access to more philosophy than I could read in 1,000 lifetimes. And so that is going to be really useful for developing my own philosophical skills. Second point, people in the past were much more likely to become cognitively impaired because, maybe they had abusive environments, maybe they had malnutrition, disease, right? These sorts of things were just much more common in the past. People in the past were just not treated very well, and so that's going to make them more likely to have cognitive problems, right? So this is less common today, at least in developed countries. Third, in the past, there were strict barriers to entire classes of people, right? Women, racial minorities, the poor were often excluded from philosophical discussion. So there's a much greater diversity of people available today. If we were in the past, right, I wouldn't be, I wouldn't be doing philosophy. I would have been just, working in a field somewhere, I assume, right? I'm not rich. I'm not a rich dude, so I wouldn't have been able to do philosophy. So at least, I don't think I'd be creating any kind of philosophy that anybody else would be reading, right? And I wouldn't really have had the opportunities to develop my philosophical skills or my philosophical knowledge. Even if I was in some sense doing philosophy, I would certainly not have been able to, access anything like the materials that I've been able to access today. And I probably wouldn't be putting my ideas out there in such a way that other people could hear them. So today we've got this much greater diversity, and that gives us maybe different perspectives. It means we're less likely to exclude skilled people. The fourth point is that people just have more free time to devote themselves for philosophical training. Also, fifth, philosophy builds on prior work. As I said earlier, philosophy is like a long conversation, and we have access to thousands of years of work that was not available to the ancients. We also have access to thousands of years of work in other disciplines that can inform philosophical work. So Sauer summarizes the point here. He says, what philosophical historicists are ultimately committed to is the idea that extremely small and underdeveloped societies with highly exclusive privileges of access to the relevant resources have produced much better philosophers than extremely large, globally interconnected and much more inclusive societies. And, that seems extremely implausible, right? The more reasonable expectation is that past philosophers were just kind of generally not that great. Okay, so another argument is what we might call the argument by example. I'm not sure if this argument has ever appeared in print anywhere, but Michael Huemer presents it in a blog post titled "Great Philosophers Are Bad Philosophers." So the argument by example takes the great figures from the history of philosophy, and then it shows that their philosophical work was bad. I think essentially the argument goes like this. Huemer doesn't present it in quite this way, so this is kind of my gloss on it, but I think the argument is supposed to work something like this. Premise 1. So historical philosophers A, B, C, right, whichever ones you look at, right, historical philosophers A, B, C, etc. are widely considered to be among the greatest philosophers. Premise 2, the philosophical work of A, B, C, etc. is bad in a way that would simply be disqualifying today. It wouldn't get published. People just wouldn't take it seriously today. Premise 3, it is highly unlikely that the work of lesser-known historical philosophers is significantly better than the work of the historical philosophers considered the greatest. So, we're probably not going to get much better philosophical work if we turn our attention to those historical philosophers who have just been forgotten. Okay, so the conclusion is historical philosophers are generally bad philosophers. Look, the greatest of the historical philosophers, you know what? They kind of suck. And it's very unlikely that the unknown historical philosophers are going to be much better. So historical philosophers just generally kind of suck. And then, obviously the further point is that reading the work of bad philosophers is unlikely to help you solve philosophical problems. So reading history of philosophy is unlikely to help you solve philosophical problems. All right, so obviously the primary claim here, is going to be premise 2, right? It's this claim that the philosophical work of these greats is going to be bad in a way that would be disqualifying today. Hume specifically targets Plato, Hume, and Kant. He argues that they all have ways in which they're just obviously bad. I won't go through all 3 of them, but I'll just mention a couple of points he raises about Plato and Hume. Okay, so take Plato. In the Republic, Plato presents an argument by Thrasymachus that what Thrasymachus says is that the government rules for its own good and that the government treats citizens the way that a shepherd treats sheep, right? It's like shepherd treats sheep as material to be used for wool and meat. Insofar as shepherds provide care for their sheep, it's only in their own self-interest. Of course, they're going to butcher the sheep as soon as it benefits them. Thrasymachus is saying this is basically how the government acts, right? It just treats the citizens as material to be used for its own good. Plato then has Socrates respond that, well, the art of the shepherd in itself is concerned with the good of the sheep. Similarly, the art of medicine in itself is concerned with health. Now, Hume points out that the trouble with this response is it's just completely irrelevant. Thrasymachus only brings up the shepherds as an analogy. What he's really interested in is how government leaders behave in the real world, and answering that requires empirical evidence about the behaviour of real-world governments. What shepherds and doctors do is irrelevant, and how to understand the true art of shepherding as such, or medicine as such, is clearly irrelevant, right? So this is just a terrible response. Now, again, this is only one example, but Hume says that Plato frequently appeals to these obviously stupid, obviously irrelevant arguments by analogy. So this is, one example of this. As for Hume, well, Hume says, and I quote, "The biggest problem with Hume was that he was constantly drawing absurdly sceptical conclusions about almost anything, and this doesn't seem to bother him. He doesn't stop and say, wow, that sounds crazy, maybe my starting assumptions are wrong." Now, of course, if you've seen my videos before, it will probably come as no surprise to you that I'm kind of more on Hume's side on this one. I really don't see... I don't see the problem with drawing what Michael Hume would consider to be absurdly sceptical conclusions. In fact, from my point of view, that kind of seems like philosophy being done right. But there is a better point, I think, that Hume makes against Hume, which is that many of Hume's arguments are based on these extremely questionable empirical hypotheses. So, in particular, Hume's basic assumption is that all ideas are copies of impressions, which is to say that any concept that you form in your mind, so that's an idea, any concept you form in your mind must have a basis in sensory experience, namely your impressions, right? So the idea is like, I can imagine red, right? Like I can imagine a red square, okay? And Hume's idea is, well, that's derived from the experience of red and the experience of square things. So like my ability to imagine a red square is a kind of copy of my impressions of red things and things that are square. Now, as it turns out, there are numerous concepts that just don't seem as if they could have been formed by simply copying impressions. So the concept of causation, the concept of necessity, the concept of self. On this basis, Hume draws the skeptical conclusion that we just have no such concepts. Or he is sort of forced to, reframe the concepts in ways that are actually quite unnatural. Like, so Hume grants that, well, yes, we do kind of have a concept of cause, but it's not really anything like what we might initially have thought the concept of cause is, but anyway, like Hume's general strategy here is, we think that we have a certain set of concepts. Hume shows that those concepts could not have been derived from sensory impressions, and so then he concludes that we just have no such concepts. The problem with this is that there's just no good reason to believe the hypothesis that all ideas are copies of impressions. Strikingly, Hume himself actually presents a counterexample to this hypothesis. So it's the missing shade of blue. So suppose that a person has never seen blue before. Suppose you show this person a series of blue colour swatches showing every shade of blue but with one shade removed. Now, the question is, would this person be able to form the idea of that missing shade of blue? Well, Hume says, yeah, they probably would be able to, right? So surely that shows, well, it's just false then that all ideas must be copies of impressions, right? Like that seems like a pretty, I mean, look, there are not many knockdown arguments in philosophy, all right? But that seems like about as close as you're going to get to a knockdown argument, right? You're claiming all ideas must be copies of impressions, but now you've just given us an example of an idea that's not a copy of an impression, right? How does Hume respond to this apparently very serious problem? Well, this is what he says, and this is the entirety of what he says. This instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing, and does not merit that it. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, let's try that again. What Hume says is, this instance is so singular that it is scarcely worth our observing, and does not merit that for it alone we should alter our general maxim. Okay, that's it. That's his entire response. He presents this obvious counterexample to the theory that he's using to derive all of his crazy conclusions, okay? And then he just blows right past it. He just doesn't seem to trouble him at all. He doesn't seem to care about it. It doesn't seem to bother him that like the foundation of his work is just completely blown up by this example. I mean, clearly this is not an acceptable argumentative strategy. This is not something that we would allow today, right? Okay, so these are just a couple of examples, of course. And, there are also lots of modern philosophers who will tie themselves up in knots trying to come up with interpretations which avoid attributing obvious errors to the great philosophers. But at least at face value, shoddy thinking is very common among the great philosophers. So, look, there are modern interpreters who will try to, argue that actually Hume's response wasn't as stupid as it seems. But it kind of seems like it probably was as stupid as it seems. Like maybe Hume was just like, he just had an off day, right? And this particular point, but anyway, so yes, you can like reinterpret it, and maybe there's actually something a bit more clever going on here. But there's a lot of really bad argumentation, really bad reasoning, just crazy illogical thinking when you look at past philosophers, and you're probably not going to be able to just reinterpret all of them, right? Like it seems like actually a lot of the great philosophers were kind of just bad at philosophy. So, yes, that's the argument by example. All right, so this is a final argument that Sauer makes, which I'm calling the hypocrisy argument. So, it appears that historians of philosophy themselves exhibit, in their actual behaviour, a lack of concern for history of philosophy. So, history of philosophy itself has a history. There have been many historians of philosophy in the past who believed that studying history of philosophy could lead to interesting philosophical insights. However, contemporary historians of philosophy spend almost no time engaging with past historians of philosophy. If you want to, really dig into Plato and understand Plato, you're not going to study the work of historians from the 1800s, right? You're going to read Plato, sure, but then in terms of the secondary literature, you're then going to read the contemporary Plato scholars. Like, the historians of the 1800s are not... Like, if you write an article about Plato and the interpretation of Plato, you're going to be responding to contemporary Plato scholars, right? You're not going to be citing the historians of the 1800s in your paper. You're going to be talking to contemporary people. Indeed, as Sauer says, few people even know about the works of Jacob Friedrich Fries, Johann Friedrich Harp. I'm not even going to try to say these names, all right? I've got them written down there on the slide, so, just read them there. But the point is, few people know about the work of these very famous philosophers from the past, these major figures in the past, in the study of the history of philosophy, right? But we just don't pay attention to that anymore. So if philosophical historicism is true, if the history of philosophy is valuable for investigating contemporary philosophical problems, then why is it that when you look at journals in the history of philosophy, the discussion is almost exclusively of contemporary work in the history of philosophy? Like, historians of philosophy are not really that interested in their own history. Like, they don't seem to regard their own history as containing significant insights. So it's a little bit strange that, we would then think that, well, like, the kind of, like, just history of philosophy in itself contains these special insights when it comes to other philosophical problems. All right, then. Before we end, it's worth considering the implications that the rejection of philosophical historicism has for our view of contemporary philosophy. So let's say we think that most philosophers historically are bad philosophers, and it's not really worth studying their work. Well, on the one hand, this might seem somewhat optimistic, because it means that philosophy is in a better state now than it has been at any other time in history. That we are living in a golden age of philosophy. Philosophers today are much more competent than the ones who came before them. Their work is much more worthwhile. Well, things maybe aren't quite so rosy, because all of the work being produced today is going to become history in the future. Philosophy is going to continue, and the factors that have made contemporary philosophy so much better than past philosophy will continue to operate. For example, we saw that one of the reasons why contemporary philosophy is supposedly so much better than past philosophy is that we have access to much more sophisticated scientific research. Contemporary philosophers can draw from a more sophisticated empirical understanding. But of course, we should expect that science will continue to progress in the future. The scientific theories that we accept today will probably seem remarkably ignorant compared to what will be accepted in 500 years. I mean, assuming that we don't, destroy, assuming that AI doesn't kill us all or climate change doesn't lead to the collapse of civilization. Like, if the world continues to progress, right, like, science is going to become much more sophisticated, so the science of today will seem ignorant in 500 years' time. So if past philosophy was bad on account of its poor understanding of science, we should conclude that philosophy today is also bad for the same reason. We would be justified in thinking that contemporary philosophy is good only if science had come to an end, but that's not the case. So basically, the dismissal of past philosophy leads to a pessimistic induction against present philosophy, right? The philosophical work of all previous times was bad. There's no relevant difference between previous times and the present time, so the philosophical work of the present is probably bad as well. I have a video on pessimistic induction arguments against philosophy. It's called Anti-Philosophy, a Pessimistic Induction. I'll link that in the comments. Anyway, the point of this would be, look, contemporary philosophy is mostly pointless. Sauer is actually aware of this implication of his argument. He states, and I quote, "Contemporary philosophers today also have insufficient information and are thus also likely to be wrong about everything." Oh dear. Ultimately, however, Sauer thinks that there is still some justification for paying attention to contemporary philosophy. His idea is that, okay, sure, contemporary philosophy is bad by the standards of future philosophy. However, what he says is, said improved future work in philosophy would never have come into existence in the first place if we didn't do philosophy now. So basically, we should keep doing contemporary philosophy just because this will create the conditions for some good philosophy at some point in the future. I mean, that might seem, I think, like a fairly unsatisfying result. I think many philosophers want to believe that they are uncovering truths about important subjects, that they're doing something to understand the way the world is, and what we can know about it, and what we ought to do. But Sauer doesn't seem to think that this is really defensible. All we can hope for is that maybe our work might inspire somebody better at some point in the future. So, I don't know, it's a rather depressing vision of what we're achieving, I suppose. Now, the fact that anti-historicism leads to the rejection of contemporary philosophy raises an obvious worry about self-defeat. Anti-historicism is itself a philosophical position, and any argument for anti-historicism is a philosophical argument. But obviously these arguments are produced by contemporary philosophy, and as we've seen, such arguments will soon become history. The anti-historicist therefore seems forced to concede that their own argument will be judged to be shoddy by the standards of future philosophy, and the standards of future philosophy are better than our standards today. So the anti-historicist argument is almost certainly a bad argument, in which case it seems we just shouldn't trust the anti-historicist argument, right? Now Sauer might say, well, this is no good reason for dismissing the anti-historicist argument. After all, we need contemporary work. We need the contemporary work that takes this argument seriously, so that it lays the foundations for the better work that comes in the future. I think that point is all well and good, but it does seem to undermine the normative implications of anti-historicism, namely the idea that we ought to spend less time studying the history of philosophy. Because the trouble is, well, we have no idea what direction things will go in the future. We don't know whether the future philosophers will favour historicism or anti-historicism. The mere fact that it's worth presenting arguments for anti-historicism does not entail that we ought to spend less time studying the history of philosophy, because it may be worth presenting arguments for anti-historicism, but maybe what's going to happen is that that's going to, the debate will ultimately resolve in a more pro-historicist position, and maybe the arguments for anti-historicism played an important role in terms of challenging pro-historicists to come up with better arguments. So yes, it's still worth presenting these arguments for anti-historicism because of how that's going to contribute to the debate going forward. But maybe the right position is actually pro-historicism, and maybe future philosophers will, form a consensus on pro-historicism. So just because it's worthwhile for us today to present arguments for anti-historicism, that's not going to entail that we ought to spend less time studying history of philosophy. We would have to actually establish pro-historicism for that. Moreover, the studies of history of philosophy might, for all we know, also be useful as foundations for better work in the future. Again, we just don't know what the future holds, so it's kind of impossible to say, right? So it does seem like if Sauer is arguing, he does argue that we should be spending less time on the history of philosophy, but the fact that anti-historicism is a philosophical position, that any argument for it's a philosophical argument, does seem to maybe undermine that normative claim. Okay, well, that's it for that video, so thank you for watching. I will see you next time, whenever that may be. Bye for now.